My name is Eric Rotkow. I'm with a company called ZJ Digital. We're a consulting firm, not a digital marketing firm. And so in the next 45 minutes or so, we're going to talk about the view from the consulting firms. We actually get the inside view of how your clients are starting to organize themselves. I think from where you sit, their world is changing. There's not one creative buyer, there are many, and they buy creative in other marketing, in other agency services in different ways. And so in the next hour, we're going to walk through many of the trends and a lot of what the intelligentsia is driving in terms of how large marketing organizations organize themselves so that you can align your business to how they're buying services, okay? You might be asking the question, what is an operating model, right? So you came here, so I might have piqued your interest. Give me 15 minutes and we'll define what an operating model is, right? Okay. If there's something that bothers you throughout, feel free to ask a question. We're going to try to save the questions till the end, but by all means, ask questions as we go. That might upset the microphone folks. Some of the slides are a little bit dense. This is kind of a presentation, and it's meant to be something you can use afterwards. So I encourage you to get the deck afterwards, so there are tools you can use as you talk about your competitive strategies. Okay. So as it turns out, it's hard to find a picture of whack-a-mole without a kid with a mullet. And so just bear with me. The mullet has nothing to do with the metaphor. But if you've been in the marketing or creative space since the late 90s, when I kind of entered the business world, you've seen a lot of change. It started with database marketing, and then something called email, and then web, and then mobile, and now Internet of Things, and the sky's the limit, right? And so we've seen a lot of change. The agencies have had to roll with it. I understand that a lot of you are creative-driven, others of you are digital-driven. This talk is going to address both, but it acknowledges that we are in a digital world, no doubt about it. I would say in the last 3 years as a consultant, we've seen less mystery around what we call the ad tech stack and the martech stack. I assume a lot of you are very immersed in those things. And we're seeing in our business that marketing leaders, particularly the CMO office, is much more concerned now more than ever with how their teams work together, kind of the intersection of process and technology. I'm sorry, process and teams. Technology is less of a mystery. And so the whack-a-mole continues, right? So now the whack-a-mole is on org design, roles and responsibilities. How does the internal agency work with the external agency? Okay, and that's what we're going to call an operating model in a few minutes. But before we do that, let's talk about, and this kind of relates to the last session if you were in this room, what are all the different types of marketing service providers? The term agency means all sorts of things, right? I serve marketing, I'm not an agency, but in some ways I compete for the same dollars, right? And so if we divide the world into, this is one of those dense slides, the services firms who touch the customers and the others who touch more of the back office, and look at their skill sets and the types of services they bring to market, it becomes a little clearer. I consider my firm to be marketing operations. We're somewhere in the middle. We connect the front office and the back office. I think the classic agency model is more towards customer engagement. And then you have your Accentures and others that have historically focused on the back office but are now reaching forward. All right? If we blow this out a little bit, and if the room was smaller, I would ask you where you see your agency and where the exceptions are. But just to take 4 types of flavors of marketing service providers, captive vendors like the historical Accenture type model and Capgemini. Digital agencies are strong here and they're strong here and might have some other gaps. So I won't read the slide to you, but the point is it's an open field. And in my view, in our view, those firms who can connect the dots with the right partner networks and come up with the right offering, which we'll talk about later, can service the marketing department. And it really takes this higher order view of the world to serve the CMO, not this fragmented mix of digital types and creative types, and so on. Before we go any further, just a little bit about why, where our view of the world comes from. Like I said, we're not an agency, we're a consulting firm. we generally we like to work for the CMO, but it's often one level down for the head of marketing operations that's in charge of systems and process and standards and things like that. And we often help onboard agencies and things like that with vendor management type activities. But our goal is we orchestrate the broader work for our clients, all the way from the marketers working with the agency to how when it's time to execute, some of the work goes to outside agencies and some of the work stays in. We're going to talk a lot about that. The other reason why we have a lot to say on this subject is because my company only works for marketing, but with the clients that we have, there's always a McKinsey or a BCG working above us. And so they kind of create the greater context for the world that we're working in. When it comes to marketing, they historically haven't gone so deep. But the presentation that you're going to see today is basically a synthesis of learnings from what I'm calling the intelligentsia, McKinsey's of the world. All right. So I found this great quote from the CMO of Deloitte Digital. So I'm not going to read most of the slides to you, but this one is worth reading. When you as a CMO can be the growth driver of the business, you have a whole new power. To empower that generation of CMOs, you need to do a much broader base of capabilities and understanding of business and technology strategy, understanding of depth, data, and analytics. And that's not what historically the agency model is based on. Now, you probably are trending in that direction for some clients. That's different than taking an account supervisor, an account manager, and letting them talk to the CMO and they come up with a beautiful deck. I'm talking about a deliverable, a capability you sustain and grow. And so Deloitte's actually doing a lot of things in this space. They're buying agencies, and so you can kind of get the gist of what they're saying. But let's take a minute and level set. So I'm going to try to look through your eyes and boil up the most relevant issues. Business models are converging. You have the consultants entering. You have digital firms of different types converging. Content types are converging. Everything's converging. And so this idea of multiple vendor types, that's not the way buyers are buying, right? You have to provide a turnkey solution that works on their platform, okay? And we're going to talk about this idea of a platform quite a bit. Program is complex. You have your traditional, you have a whole ecosystem of traditional suppliers and a whole ecosystem of digital suppliers. How does that all work together? Do you work with internal creators or do you work with marketers or merchandising, no matter what your position is? This idea of a digital platform is paramount. The idea that we'll talk about, the idea of outsourcing creative is not necessarily the path to the future. The idea is if you're going to operate on your client's platform, you have to be part of the client. In the last talk, there was this whole discussion about staff augmentation, selling FTEs versus projects and things like that. I can tell you it's going in the FTE direction. So you can choose to, it's argumentative and it's not, but it's going that direction. So be prepared for it. And we'll talk about that more later, what it means to actually provide particular resources rather than projects. It might be something to embrace rather than fight. Okay. Thematically, there is an opportunity to diversify, right? I think if you're sitting in this room, there's opportunities to take the business that you're in and to get into other areas. The question is, what other areas? Again, this might be a bit argumentative too, but the idea is that it seems to be, if you read the business press, it seems to be easier for the consultants to get into the agency world versus vice versa. And so what are the learnings from that? It's a bit rhetorical, but there's something to be learned there, right? I'm not just going to ask questions, I'm going to answer some too, so don't worry. Right. So what does this all mean? There is the chance that your relationships are becoming more narrow and transactional, whereas before you got to set the agenda if you were plugged in at the right level. Buying a particular project, a direct mail creative versus a retainer-based, messaging-driven strategy, right? I should have mentioned in the whack-a-mole slide, the game of whack-a-mole, the customer experience mole of the whack-a-mole was probably 2 years ago, right? Aligning to the customer experience allows you to elevate your offering, right? How does your creative or digital tactics or whatever you're offering, how does that fit into the overall context, right? And so if you don't do that in a way that helps your client scale, you're going to be irrelevant, right? And so driving the customer experience at scale. The way that we do that in my business is we provide processes and tools and templates, messaging frameworks and things like that that help marketers around the organization and creatives around the organization scale based out of one strategy, right? And so it's not just about delivering content or creative or software. It's about helping multiple people, multiple teams around an organization use it on their platform. And then clearly there's an opportunity to reinvent the agency model. And we'll talk more about that. And so thus we get to this idea of digital transformation. I'm curious in how your business is if you're confronted with the dramatic change of digital transformation. And I bet if we went around the room, we'd probably get 5 or 6 different flavors of the definition of digital transformation. When I say it, and for the purposes of this discussion, it's a wholesale reinvention of the business. It's for the client list you saw before. It's leaving the current state operations and building another operation that fits a digital world, not digital marketing, but fits a digital world, and they may or may not choose to turn off the current state organization. It is as dramatic a change as you can think of. It's not just digitizing content. Again, this is a little bit pithy, argumentative, but the idea of this presentation is to help you to provoke thought in how you can organize your agencies in a way that buyers are buying. So if we can understand how clients are organizing themselves at this intersection of teams and process, you can hopefully dramatically improve the way that you go to market. Okay? Nobody's walked out yet, so I assume it's reasonably in the right direction. Okay. So I'm sure you can vouch for this because many of you have been working with marketing longer than I have. The way marketers think about their organizations has not changed much. You have the CMO, you might have the head of insights, the head of direct marketing, you might have brand teams. And it hasn't really changed all that much. And in my view, in our view, that's been the stifling change management challenge of the last however many years. You can implement all the technology in the world, but if you don't fix the organization, it's not going to work. And so parallel to that is the idea of sourcing talent, right? I don't say sourcing creative, but I say sourcing talent. You kind of have your leading edge change companies, kind of like the ones I tried to list on the first few slides. But then you have the other 80, 90% that are not there. And they're still going to agencies. They know they're still going to agencies in the same way they did before. But I think what we're starting to see in the last 18 months or so is that even that next tier of progressive or more progressive marketing leaders are starting to think about more interesting and more progressive ways of outsourcing and bringing in talent, right? So this chocolate chip cookie is your client's current state, potentially. In this model, this is not an operating model. We'll look at that in a minute. You'll see, in this generic version, you'll see 4 divisions, right? Each division is made up of chocolate chips. Some of the chocolate chips are creative services that may or may not work with an outside agency. Some are shared services that might, in one division, that might be a shared service for another division. Or they might fully outsource something. And so the idea is the current organization from a marketing perspective has evolved. It's not necessarily deliberately designed. That was not a biblical reference. It's not, okay, you can laugh at that. So, and so what we're saying is there's this evolved marketing current state that is now turning into this more formal operating model because the digital world has required it. You can't have a happenstance organization. So let's get deeper into that. So led by the intelligentsia, there is a new way of organizing marketing departments. And so in our experience, this is who we've kind of listened to that's paving the cow path. McKinsey in particular, we love their view of the world. So before we go any further, if they're defining a new type of operating model, what is an operating model? It's the highest order view of how people and process intersect to plan and activate. Okay, and we'll look at some examples in a second. And so, if I were going to design an operating model, here's what would be changing. If you agree that the role of marketing has changed and it's now becoming a profit center and largely charged with unifying the customer experience, they're much more nuanced in how they plug in external service providers. There's fluid planning across functions. The shift to agile, we're going to talk about that more in the next few minutes. The idea of selling projects versus selling FTEs. Think about agile. Try to get your head around that. You got to sell FTEs. And then staff augmentation to fill critical talent gaps. All right. And then, I alluded to this before, the classic org design view of the world just doesn't, it's not descriptive enough of how work happens. And so typically, the C-level and their direct reports would coming up with boxes and arrows that's top secret and nobody gets to see it. But that doesn't enable a business. And so you would have somebody 10 levels down from that, probably in IT, doing a Six Sigma project to figure out how everyone works together. That doesn't work. And so what my company's trying to do and adopting some of the intelligentsia thoughts is applying, coming up with new views of the world to help marketing operate better, right? And to help engage agencies better. I think as far as that whole bunch of words at the bottom, the idea is this idea of a platform, an ecosystem, and activation. Activation is not a linear process in a digital world. It is coordinating a mix of internal and external service providers. And that's the core of what has to happen in an operating model. All right. So if you were your clients and you were the chief marketing officer working with somebody like me to design an operating model, what are the questions that you would say, Eric, you better answer these questions or I'm not paying you? These are those questions. Do internal teams drive creation or align to existing direction from external agencies, right? We have a whole business built on helping internal agencies, which if you're not around it, that's become a very formal part of the world. Internal agencies have probably taken work away from y'all. It varies by industry. Financial services in particular and others have big internal agencies. But who drives creation and who aligns to it? Do the internal and external agencies compete or do they collaborate? What level of overlap? Should all the agencies be doing the same thing? Or should they focus on their particular strengths? If the agency is driving strategy, what's the job of the internal marketing person? What's the role of the internal marketing person? Do they get to decide who develops this creative, internal or external? And we never win that conversation. We have to facilitate that. And then I mentioned before, in terms of my company, we often enter through this marketing operations idea. It's kind of, I don't know, Trojan horse isn't the right word, but we worked for basically the shared service of shared services, right? And so we get a view into pretty much everything. And so it's often the case in a world where there's multiple external creative groups and internal creative groups, it's this marketing operations idea that unifies everything. And we'll look at that in a second. So just a couple more slides, and then we'll look at some pictures. There's been a lot of words. So in 2017, here are my operating model design principles. Think of internal and external teams as an ecosystem, not as outsourcing. Centralized resource management, prioritization, and standards across teams. And as an agency, the more that you can have access to the marketing operations folks, you can control your own destiny. Treat different types of work differently for efficiency and scale. And so my clients are, some go way overboard. I won't get into all the types of work, whether it's new high creative or more transactional creative, like fixed repeatable stuff. But they're using those breakdowns to define what goes to the internal agency and what goes to the outside agency. And so and if you agree that that's happening and you see it in your clients, you need to know what your clients are deliberately insourcing and outsourcing so that you can attach to it. Those sub-bullets there separate new custom creation from fixed repeatable. That's probably the most basic split that we see. A group of creatives who are concept driven and others who are more a lower skill set just to make changes to existing creative. The next bullet might not be intuitive. In a digital world, we're seeing clients have a core group of creatives or in the in-house agency that do the stuff that the company knows how to do well. But there's also this group that's usually at another site that's called edge work, and that's more the innovation lab work that's all agile, right? And so that's, when I say the intelligentsia is leading the charge on that, I would say that bullet more than any, they are breaking their clients into core and edge and taking the edge off-site in developing journeys in a very cool but expensive way. The other one, the last idea here, in terms of my business, we do a lot of process work. It used to be that there was planning, there was a brief, and then it's time to execute. If your world is creeping into agile, that model doesn't really work anymore. There's some basic planning to align all the agile teams, but the planning happens in the scrums and the sprints and things like that. And so we have to design our offering to meet that. Okay, so we're going to get to some graphics. Hold on to your seatbelts. Okay. We're going to move a little faster. So this is the high level. It does look like an org design. But the idea is, in a generic sense, we're going to break the world into the CMO, the in-house agency, marketing operations, integrated marketing, and this idea of the digital lab. This is all your brand managers. This is insights. This is everybody who's not in the in-house agency, right? And so it used to be that the in-house agency was kind of stuck in here, and it became kind of kludgy on who was accountable for what. And so I think accountability more than anything else is the reason to separate this integrated marketing idea versus the in-house agency. There's a great association called the In-House Agency Forum that is the de facto, I'm sure they'd love me saying that, is the group where in-house agency leaders meet. And it's a very similar vibe to this. It's people who used to work at agencies are now leading in-house agencies. So if you're curious, they have benchmarks for cycle times and all that sort of stuff for in-house agencies. If you email me afterwards, I can send you some of the benchmarks and stuff like that. Okay, so now we're going to blow out this graphic. And so if you were to take your magnifying glass and hold it over each one of these boxes, we're going to show you what it would look like. So first in the in-house agency, they're structuring like an external agency. There are account managers. There's a hierarchy of account managers that may or may not include project managers. But like I said before, they're dividing the world into work types. So you have your new custom creatives. You have your fixed repeatable creatives. And the client I stole this from just had about 80-20 split. But that's the idea. And so I think you want to be in the new custom world, generally, right? And this can look 1,000 different ways for 1,000 different companies. This is intended to be generic. And so the in-house agency works for integrated marketing. The account managers are typically aligned to how the integrated marketing folks are worked. So if it's organized by brand or by geography, the account managers would be aligned in that respect. So it might not be different than how you mirror your clients, how you line up, but the message here is they're doing the same thing, right? So they're heightening the creative dynamic. And then with that, so the next part of the build, so where does the agency come in? The agencies are typically, in a generic sense, they're outsourcing, the clients are outsourcing paid media, broadcast, and owned is staying in. If it's a retailer, signage stays in and stuff like that, right? And then we bring in this idea of the digital lab. And you can see that we're separating the in-house agency from the digital lab. These are around new tools, new journeys. And this is once the journeys are developed, then they go to the in-house agency to maintain, right? And then lastly, again, where I sell into is this marketing operations idea that's kind of like the underbelly of the whole thing, right? probably shouldn't describe my world as underbelly. But, okay, so this is, when we say operating model, this is the generic high-level view. And so when we get to the end of this, we're going to look at how you could potentially line up or not line up with each of these elements, okay, as you think about what you're going to do with your agencies going forward. All right. So let's focus on the in-house agency a little bit. You know, it used to be that there was a marketing department and there were creatives spread throughout. The designers had these loose relationships with other designers. The writers have loose relationships with other writers, and so on. By centralizing the in-house agency, that's not the case anymore. And so this actually came from a large financial services client where, you know, if you're familiar with the term ring fencing, I heard about it years ago, and then it kind of is reemerging. It's the idea of building walls around your team, so you know what your team does, so you can pass the work to the next team, right? And so if you're an in-house agency, you have to decide, are you full service, or are you a service bureau, or do you focus on specific media types? Or do you live within the BUs, right? Do you live within your clients? Are you distributed? Okay. And so this is the work that we do a lot of, but if you do this work, somebody's got to say, if we focus on these media types and this media type, what does the outside agency do, okay? So if you agree that you have in-house and out-house agencies, how does everyone work together or not work together, right? So we're calling this the collaboration model. So here in the strategy bar on the x-axis, you can either drive creative or you can align to someone else's creative. On the y-axis, you can either compete or you can collaborate, right? And I can tell you this is not an academic exercise. Clients are going through this, and I'm sure you have some examples of sessions that you've had with your clients to define how everyone works together in a very practical way. There's some great case studies out there. State Farm is a great one of how the internal and external agencies have worked together. This is one of those slides that if you get the deck afterwards, you can take it in. The idea is that wherever you plot your relationship on this map, there's specific implications about who does what. Okay. All right, so in a digital world, like we said, if you're operating on a platform in an ecosystem, you're not just outsourcing creative. The creative has to operate on a platform. And so what we're seeing is very much this idea of agency or talent staffing provider, provide us with your best people to sit on this agile team, right? And that, you know, breaks the classic agency model. And so here it applies mostly to the in-house agency in the digital lab idea. And so just very pragmatically, if a team has these 5 roles on it and the client doesn't have those roles, they're going to go looking for these roles, right? And so if my clients struggle with one thing more than any other, it's where do I get these people, right? And it's not always obvious to go to the agency. And so this is generically, these are their options. They struggle tremendously sometimes with finding talent, particularly when the large consulting firm comes in, like the BCGs and McKinseys, who have world-class talent, but they're so expensive, and they want to augment it with talent that they find themselves. That's the real challenge, and I think that's one of the great opportunities if you're comfortable selling, you know, in that model. Okay, so the last section here is, we have about 15 minutes. Where are the opportunities to compete? And so there's no shortage of issues to navigate. So let's talk about, within the context that we've talked about, who are we serving? And then who are we competing with? So I kind of stacked the deck, so this is not going to be a surprise. This is who we're serving. But as an agency in this evolved view of the world, if you agree with it in this new operating model idea, you're going to have to really parse out who you want to be selling to, right? There is a question mark next to the CXO because I'm not quite sure what they do, but anyway, but for the others, it's pretty clear. Are you selling planning and strategic work? Do you want to compete with the internal agency? Do Do you want to get into this lab business where the innovation happens, where you could take your best architects and plant them at the client? Right? That has some interesting financial implications, right? And then marketing operations, which don't get into that business. Just call me. Okay. So let's put it all together. There's a million ways to slice this. As you go back and run your agencies, I'm sure you're having some pretty heady discussions about what you want to do with your lives and where you want to take your businesses and what your people want to be doing. Again, there's a million ways to slice this, but for the sake of conversation here, we're going to look at those two ideas along these dimensions. So do you want to be selling into marketing, or do you want to be selling into the brand or the enterprise level, so the whole C-suite? Do you want to drive the customer experience, right? Not just the marketing touch points. Or do you want to be full service or focus on a particular area, and in this case, digital? Okay. Again, there's infinitely ways we could talk about this. If you want to talk about it and shoot the breeze, I'd be happy to. All right, so I guess he saw this slide coming. So this is the most dense slide in the presentation, and it's kind of the last slide. But what we're going to do is we're going to take each of these areas that we're going to serve, and we're going to look at it by the dimensions we just talked about. So client breadth, scope of services, and so these are kinds of the decisions that you'll have to come to. Okay, and this is intended to be a thought-provoking tool perhaps you could use following today. So let's dive in. If you want to be selling to the CMO, the management consultants, if your firm is large enough, are probably already own that relationship, right? And to the degree that the CMO is engaged in the agency of record, that they're probably are bending their ear, right? I guess less and less in most companies, digital is less carved out to be its own world, and it's more integrated across marketing and across creative. But since digital equals marketing, it's a little tactical for the CMO if that's the case, if you're just thinking of yourself as a digital agency. If you're full service, it's a little bit different, but you have to communicate in the context of this operating model. So how does the agency, if you're the agency of record leading the charge on strategy and brand, how does that apply to the whole operating model, right? Not just media types that you're focused on. And it's kind of a power play if you think of it that way. And so based on that, as you think about your businesses, do you want to get into the consulting business? I don't know. But if you do, that's what you have to do, right? And you could coach the CMO. While I think that management consultants are in the C-suite, are with the CMO, I have not seen the level of coaching and secret PowerPoint decks fed to the CMO that I see in other areas. And so I do think there's opportunity for better management consulting for the CMO. This idea, I'll skip over that one, but this idea of activation, if you want to sell to the CMO, you really have to think about the org design as an arbitrary construct. That's not the way the business operates. And so if you can work with the CMO to dream up solutions that transcend the org design and are not constrained, we see opportunity there. I want to make sure we have time for questions, so I don't think we're going to go through the whole thing. But so what we've done here, and as you go back to your agencies, think about who you want to be selling into, where are you today, and how do you move on? How do you either go up market, down market, sideways, leftways? You might not agree with these implications, and so this is, that's part of what strategy is, right? Making your assumptions and breaking them, and I'm just one guy, right? And so you know your clients better than anybody, and so you have to figure out how they see the world, right? A couple highlights. I really see this digital lab idea as the future. If to the degree that Agile can and does apply to marketing, you're not going to be involved in it if you don't line up with your clients that way. And that's where they're building the cool stuff. Otherwise, it just turns into creative work, right? That's the romantic part of all this. Where it says in A, it's a little bit of a stretch, I think, a little bit far from the agency definition. And so that's why some of the cells aren't filled in. But one thing is clear, and it's nice that this talk kind of came after the last one, which was compensation models. That is the challenge, is that do you want to be selling projects? It would be nice to be selling year-long retainers, as agency of record. But if you don't think about the staff augmentation idea and selling your best people to drive strategy, sitting at the client, shoulder to shoulder as a team, number one, you're going to be on the inside. But number two, that's the way that, because of digital, that's the way stuff is getting made these days. OK, so I know this particular slide was a lot of information, but again, you'll have this. The very, very last slide, some key takeaways. It's your job to provide your clients with breakthrough ideas, but those breakthrough ideas are sometimes impossible to execute, right? And so if you can help them execute them by thinking about this new operating model, that's pretty cool, right? But that starts to get into the consulting idea, right? Looking at operations. I think, beat the horse to death with this idea of platforms and ecosystems, but that's the reason why the old agency model of outsourcing is challenging. If you're not familiar with this idea of the in-house agency, become familiar with it and figure out how to line up with your in-house agency colleagues, counterparts. Most of the time, the marketing person that's buying your services is picking the service provider, and you might not have any exposure to that. More and more, there's kind of a role in the in-house agency that gets to influence it. But if you're proactive in having that conversation, working with the internal agency, it's going to pay off. Lastly, and it's the reason my company exists, few firms have the full suite of capabilities to be the de facto marketing service provider. And I listed probably the handful of companies in the world that can do it, and there's probably another 10. But if you're a mid-size agency, and I think there's some big and small here, you have to figure out what sandboxes you want to play in, and for those you don't want to play in, who your partners are. So that's the main message there. So with that, I know that was a fast, we moved through a lot of slides. I hope you found it enriching. And that's actually a butterfly wing. So I thought I'd end with the butterfly. All right, so thank you for your attention. If there are any questions, I'd love to take some.
I was curious, who is the buyer within the internal agency, or in the last presentation I was in, I guess, the table of people that we're selling to within this internal agency?
So it depends. I'll give you a generic answer. I think that the agency of record is the CMO supported by the brand folks, I'm finding. And then marketing operations handles the mechanics of it, the negotiations, pricing, that sort of thing. The CMO is always the final, in my view, is always the final decision maker on major agency relationships.
Who's the role, like the title that we need to be looking inside of marketing operations? We want to find this person on LinkedIn that's the right person to start the conversation with.
My marketing operations role is so loose and relatively new. I don't know that there's a standard role. When we design it, it's called an agency relationship manager. But you could Google that all day and probably find 5. So what's happening is that we've all dealt with supplier managers that beat us up on master agreements and rates and all that. That role is becoming mirrored within marketing operations. So marketing is trying to keep the rest of the organization at arm's length, finance, vendor management, so that the marketing operations role, their team can manage all